I suppose it's fitting that the video I was dreading the most making of, I'm gonna say this entire project, the entire Restoring Sean project, the video I've been dreading the most is the video going through the kitchen of this house. And that's not for anything bad that happened by any means. I think by all intents and purposes, the kitchen was as smooth as it could go. It's just the kitchen project was so massive and everything really unfolded over the course of, I'm gonna say, a year from start to finish, but we're gonna find out that finish is not finished because phase 2 is essentially redoing the entire kitchen. Welcome if you are new to the channel. My name's Sean. I am Sean, and this is now all about my current house, the estate. Season 3 started with talking about how I found the house, and then we went through what the game plan was going to be for fixing it up. Now it is time to put the money where the mouth is and talk about what went into restoring the kitchen. When I first saw the house, we entered through the back door right here. So the kitchen was the first space that I saw, and it was the love at first sight story that you would want it to be. Yes, the kitchen was horrendously dated. It needed a lot of very visible updates. The bones were there. I just wanted to full steam ahead do this. From the sale of my last house, that money was going to be spent partly for the down payment, but then all new appliances, everything needed to be purchased. But coming into the kitchen, it was wallpapered. It kind of had this howdy doody country kitchen wallpaper in it. The super dated linoleum floor, a lot of custom cabinetry, but custom from 1983, so it just wasn't conducive anymore. A very weird shaped island. Obviously the stove needed to be replaced. There was a weird cabinet back by the stove. This entire process was going to be thought out. With my first house at the manor, I had a rough idea of what I wanted it to look like. You know, I wanted these black walls, and I wanted everything black, gray, and white on the first floor, and then some color up on the second floor. With the second house, the ranch, I saw this thing on Pinterest and I'm gonna do it in here. Nothing flowed together, nothing made sense. Ultimately, everything apart from my bedroom, I ended up redoing. Obviously, I just said I'm gonna be redoing the kitchen again. That's not because I feel that I did it incorrectly. As time has gone on, my understanding of dark academia has continued to evolve and progress. Sometimes you need to be in a space before you really understand what you want to do to it or how you can pull a look off. So this kitchen series is going to be 3 episodes long. Today is just part 1. We are going to be going through obviously the listing photos, the pre-work. We're going to be going through the design of the kitchen, how I came to the ideas that I did, how I organized them as well, the demolition of the kitchen, and then sheetrock and painting it. That's gonna be enough for part 1. Part 2 is going to be making it a kitchen. What was needed to get it up and running in a functional state? So putting the cabinets in, the flooring, painting everything, the appliances, trim work, the ceiling, how the ceiling was a lot, all of the electrical work, everything to get it up and running and functional. And then in part 3, which will be the final part of the kitchen series, we are gonna go through the customizing of it, how the island was created and built, the spice rack, how I designed and then executed and then redesigned and executed and then redesigned and executed the hood over the cooktop, what happened with the original kitchen cabinetry from 1893 when the house was built, how I did my pedestal dining table, and then before and after photos. Let's get started. Don't mind me as I'm looking at my computer screen to go through these photos with you guys. When I won the house, when the house was mine, I knew it was going to be mine. I got to work right away on designing it. That meant going through Pinterest, which, you know, at the time I probably had 600 photos in a general live in me folder in Pinterest, and it was organizing those ideas into what do you want to pull into this kitchen that's gonna make it feel like a vibe. And there was one photo in particular that I had that just the colors from the trim to the cabinet color to the interiors of the windows, that was what I wanted. Largely the kitchen as it was initially executed, this is what it looked like. So this kind of smoky teal greenish blue color, that was going to be the cabinets. I was going to do a white on the walls. I wanted a white trim in here, but it was not going to be pure white, which is the only color I'd ever used for trim paint. And then accents with black. So as we're looking at these pictures, you know, a lot of these cabinets that we see, they're very greens and blues, and I thought, okay, the back of the house is going to be the cool part of the house, story tone, color story wise. It's going to be the cool part. And as we move through the house, we're going to get more into from blues into the greens. And then as we go upstairs, we're going to get into the warmer colors. So the reds and purples. Some things stood out. I loved this idea of a pull-out pantry that had storage for brooms and cleaning supplies. And while I did not end up creating a pull-out one, there is a pantry just for those. You know, I wanted some cabinets to be open, others are going to stay closed. And then the big piece was going to be the ceiling. Now, the ceiling in here, we'll go through everything that it went through because there's a lot that it went through. Ultimately, I wanted this beadboard framed in ceiling. I thought it was the coolest look. In theory, it was going to be a relatively simple thing to devise, but that was what I wanted. It was going to add a lot of interest back here and character. And one of the big missions in this house was injecting character back into it. The house was really last touched in the early 80s. In the 60s, when they did their initial remodel, I think they took a lot of character out. Whatever hadn't been taken out at that point was obviously stripped in the 80s because there'd been the fire upstairs. Nothing original remained up there. Downstairs, there were bits and pieces of original stuff, but I wanted to bring that character back. Now, I know anybody with a nail gun can do this, and they do. We might get tired of seeing board and batten and wainscoting on walls everywhere. In the right space, it really makes sense. And sometimes that right space is not a 1972 ranch, which is what my last house was, which, you know, the board and batten never looked right in there. But in this house, it does look great. It's 130 years old. It makes sense. So, how can you achieve this? I used a software called Miro. I'm not sponsored by Miro, it's just what I used. What was really neat about it is that it's basically, you could screen grab everything that you did on Pinterest and make these little boards in Miro. So looking at this was the kitchen design. This was everything pulled together, and it goes into the colors I was going to be using. So Stillwater, which was the color that I used on the outside of the ranch. Snowbound, which was going to be for the walls in here, I used inside the ranch. Egret White, that was going to be the main trim color throughout the house. You could see how beige it looks, but in reality, against other colors, it just looks white. And then Tricorn Black. I've used Black Magic before. I wanted to switch to Tricorn. I have used it throughout my house, inside and out. After that, you can see those images are all pulled together. We have the lighting that I sourced primarily from Amazon. There was the idea for the cooktop with that trim around the bottom of it. And then the counters I was very confused on what counters to get. I have never had to purchase counters before. I knew that I didn't want white. In hindsight, I wish I had gotten a lighter color, but I do love my counters, and we'll get to them when we do, but that is the exact countertop that I ended up going with. I worked on this design in the weeks leading up to closing on the house. I was living with my parents in the interim. You know, I moved back to Wisconsin. There were a couple weeks before buying this house, but it was going to be months of construction before I could move in. So living at my parents, in my free time, I would work on these Miro boards, and I planned out the entire house. The very first day after closing, I changed the locks on the house. Obviously, that's what you do in general, but the reason I did it here specifically was because this house, apart from the back door, it did not have deadbolts on the house. The door to get into the front porch from outside, there were no locks at all. And then the door to get from the porch inside the house, there was no deadbolt. It just had a little chain lock, but there were windows on either side that you could just break. And then this back door had a very loose, old deadbolt. Then I needed to start working on getting rid of the oven. It was a huge oven, microwave, double oven stove thing. I'm not really sure what it was. It still worked. A lot of things in the house I tried selling, because if you could make a buck, then why not? A lot of it, no one was jumping at. So this was a piece that I ended up just getting rid of for free because I just needed it out. A nice man who lives in my area who collects vintage appliances took it, he restores them and sells them. More power to you. Next was the giant hutch. This thing, well, I would be sitting inside of it right now. That's where it was. It just was too obtrusive. There was no need to keep it. I didn't want it. It was neat, and I'm sure at the time it was very functional. You know, it had lighting in it. They must have had speakers on top of it because it had audio wire feeding into it, which was all throughout the basement. That was a whole thing. That was dismantled and brought out to the garage with the rest of the kitchen cabinets as we started doing that. The same gentleman who took the kitchen cabinets took the hutch, and he was recently retired. He'd lost his wife. It was just him and his little dog, and he was starting a woodworking shop on his property. So he took all this for free. He needed cabinets. That made me feel good in the sense that it wasn't gonna get whipped into a dumpster somewhere. With those out of the way, demolition started. As we were removing things, the more you removed, the more you found. That was wrong. For example, this photo, when I pulled the microwave out of its shelf, we saw that it was powered by an extension cord that fed through the wall down into the basement and was wired into one of the electrical boxes. It's dangerous, it's illegal. So that was one. When we took the facade down of a beam, which I assumed was a structural beam, it wasn't. It was just like cypress wood because it was very prickly, very prickly. And there was no method to the madness as we were doing stuff. We just knew the whole space needed to be emptied. And what's difficult about that is knowing where to start. Because where do you start? I've never done this. My parents had done a lot in their current house. They gutted it to the studs and a contractor added onto the house and refinished it for them. But for this, we didn't know where to start. Debris was starting to stack up in the garage. My parents were kind enough to get a dumpster. That dumpster was filled to the brim by the time it was taken. That all started with the kitchen, because in the kitchen, for the most part, they had sheetrocked over the plaster and lathe. In theory, I would have been fine leaving the plaster and lathe in place. However, the electrical in the kitchen was old and bad. With the sheetrock attached directly to it, that meant the walls were extra thick when they didn't need to be. Case in point being that that sheetrock was then flush with the trim for the doors. I didn't want my trim, level with the wall surface. I wanted it to protrude. So in this photo, that wall was where the oven was. You can see wires hanging down the inside of the wall. That was knob and tube. That was dead. Initially you see it and you're like, oh shit, there's knob and tube in the house. But the mess, you can see the mess. That silver shaft was the return air vent that feeds up into the upstairs bedroom. There was nothing that connected to it in the basement. This is the wall that is looking into where the half bath was, but you can see on the upper right, another metal shaft. That was where the exhaust fan for the kitchen connected, and then it fed through the drop ceiling that they had added below the original ceilings. On the right, that's the chimney. This was going to be the first obstacle though, in terms of planning the cabinetry, because you couldn't have a whole wall of cabinets that were the same depth if you've got a chimney there, unless you're moving walls and doing that stuff, and I didn't want to be moving walls. I'll explain how we worked around that. And it should be mentioned that a lot of this work, especially the demolition work, a lot of it was done by my parents. I was working my desk job, which is remote, but I was working my desk job at their house from 5 in the morning to about 2:30. They would come straight to the house in the morning and work until I came here by 3:30. We'd have a handoff, they'd go home, I would continue working. A lot of the demolition was stuff they did. I can't stress enough how helpful it was and how appreciative I am of my parents for all of the work that they put into this house. When I think about how much it would have cost to have a crew do it, I would have had nothing left. They would bust out the plaster and lathe. They took all the plaster off of the chimney. And then one night I got the bug up my butt to start removing the flooring. That linoleum flooring was just down in big rectangular sheets. It came up pretty easy with a crowbar, but as you'll see, I whacked my ankle with the crowbar. I still have the scar from this thing, which hurt so bad. The flooring, it came up easy, and you get to a point when you're doing this that you just start swinging at everything because everything's gotta go. Everything's covered in dust all the time. It's always a mess. As fun as demolition looks, it's really not. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of labor. When it's a space that you're gonna be living in, it's also incredibly stressful. You get to a point when it starts looking like this and everything is down to the studs that you feel hopeless and like it's never gonna get there. Some days I'd come to the house and see all the amazing progress my parents had made. Then I would stand there and look and just think, this all has to be rebuilt and I don't know how to do it. And a lot of this is learning as you go and relying on people that do know some stuff about it. It's a lot of work. You can see in this photo here, there are no headers above doors. Maybe they just designed them different back in the day. There was probably no building code for a lot of this stuff. We would find things like this in tearing out the sheetrock. You'd find nails through electrical components. I don't know who did the addition for the people that lived here, if it was contractors or, hey, I know a guy and he can do that. I lean more toward the latter, but it's things like this where I have found this issue in other parts of the house where instead of drilling through a stud and running a wire, they would just run the wire over it and put the sheetrock over that wire and just assume that it's fine. It's not, it's dangerous, it's illegal, it's a miracle that driving a nail through this didn't burn the house down over the years. Whatever, I'm not an electrician. But eventually you do start getting to a point where things are getting cleaned up. You have blank workspaces that you can work with. The outside of the drop where they put the addition onto the house and lowered the ceiling for whatever stupid reason, that starts getting cleaned up. The debris is getting cleaned up and you have a blank slate for doing work. This is an example of me just being exhausted. I don't know who I was sending this to, but it was just, it was a lot. It was a moment in time. It's also hard when you've been living on your own for 10 years. You move back home, you're displaced, all of your stuff is displaced, your pets are displaced, and you're just working around the clock. It was a long road. We left the island in the kitchen as everything was going on just to have a surface to put stuff because there was nowhere to put anything. And as this was going along, you know, it was hard to work into the evening when the sun was setting because there was no power in the kitchen anymore. Everything was disconnected. So there was no light to do anything. You start finding more knob and tube and you find that it's live. You don't know what it's going to. This knob and tube you can see here was actually running to the light in the center of the kitchen. It was the only knob and tube live in the house, but for whatever reason, they didn't replace that when they did the addition. I don't know why. That's where demo ends. And then it was time to start putting everything back together. By this point, I was ordering stuff around the clock because as the demo was going on, I needed to have a game plan for what this was going to look like. I knew the layout was going to change very slightly just from how they had it. But my initial thoughts of I'm going to do a cooktop on the island and I'm going to do this over here, it didn't make sense. The kitchen is very wide and long. And I think back here we're 18 feet wide. And then it does cut in about 4 feet. I want to say we're 27 feet long that direction. So it's a big kitchen. I wanted more storage. I knew that. I needed to have my appliances. I wanted this huge island, but how do you keep a flow and things making sense? And I kind of fell back on the idea of, well, leave it how they had it. You know, you want the sink in front of the window because I would die before I designed a kitchen where the sink was against the wall and that's what you're looking at when you're doing your dishes. The sink was gonna stay where it was. Dishwasher goes next to it, obviously. But then you have this expanse of counter. So do you wanna do your oven down there or your fridge? Well, that's gonna stick out kind of far. Maybe the oven and the fridge will go at the other end of the kitchen. I found a company, and I'll show you the pictures next week for the cabinet portion of things, but I found a company called the RTA store and you can order cabinets from them in a variety of colors and styles and really any size you can imagine. I was on a budget with this, so I wanted just the basic white. I wanted them shipped to me flat packed, so I would assemble them myself. You can get them delivered already built, but I would do it myself. But on their website, you could configure your space, and that is what I did here. This image, that is essentially how the kitchen turned out. You can see the fridge and the oven on the left side, as I planned. Cabinets all along that window wall are the actual cabinets that are currently there. I wanted a farmhouse sink in front of the window. That other sink to the right, they didn't have a cooktop that you could put in, so that's why that's a sink and not a cooktop, but the hood above it, and then the island. And one of the main design reasonings behind all of this was because this back part of the kitchen felt disconnected because of that lower roof. It just felt like if stuff didn't stop where it dropped down, then you have this massive area for what, a huge dining table? What do you put back here? I'm not a huge formal dining person. At the time, the parlor was going to be the dining room, so how many dining tables do you need? So my goal was to extend the cabinets in here and have the hood for the oven straddle the height difference in the ceilings. And once the hood was done, that's a singular piece that is your connector. So everything felt like it was one and cohesive, and you're not distracted by the ceiling height dropping. I don't even notice the ceiling height dropping anymore, really. Maybe other people do, but I don't. And I live here, so who cares? So Like I said, I was ordering all the time. By this point, which we are now at the sheetrock and paint point, cabinets were all ordered. I picked up a counter already, but it hadn't been measured. I kind of knew what flooring I was getting, but all lighting was ordered as well. Here I am trying to decide if there should be one light above the kitchen sink or two. Ultimately, it went to be two. I needed pictures so that I could hold things up where I wanted them, but I want to see it. So my parents were always very obliging with taking photos when I needed them to. As we were doing sheetrock, there was some framing going on, obviously. In this photo, this goes into the parlor. The door frame was actually a little bit more to the right, and it was narrower. The counters, when I moved in, when the countertop hit the door frame, it actually angled inward. I didn't want that. Partly because I was going to be getting quartz counters. You pay by the cut, essentially, with them, and I wasn't going to do that, but also it was just weird to have a counter that cut in. When we had taken the wall down and realized that was not A, structural, but B, there was no header in the wall. Okay, well, we can move that doorway over. I did not want a small pass-through. I wanted to lift the height of that door frame, make it a little bit more grand, because while it had original trim work, which has been recycled on another door in one of these areas, I knew I was going to be redoing the trim for it anyway. The way the cabinets were going to lay out, they were going to cut into that trim, so let's make it custom. We added a header into that to make it more structurally safe. At this point, electrical is done. The walls were nicely insulated. We put a new vapor barrier on top of them. As the sheetrock's coming together, you start getting a better glimpse of what this was going to look like. And then plumbing can start happening. And I can start planning out what the ceiling is going to be, because there were two lights in the ceiling and then the little chandelier. I want a lot more light. I don't know about you, but it's no fun being in a large space when there's no light. We'll get into this next week as well, what that plan was, but it did involve cutting huge channels into the ceiling to figure out how this was going to work. That electrical was run, everything was sheetrocked, looking good. We're in a blank space where, okay, here's a new version. You can see in the higher portion of the ceiling in this photo, that's still the ceiling that had been there, as evidenced by the shiny high gloss paint. I'm not the best at doing sheetrock, and I'm also not the best at mudding it. You gotta fucking figure it out. So I did. It was better than what had been there. God, there's a lot of pictures of just the sheetrock being done. I think I was just really proud because it was a solid surface and there was no more insulation to look at. And while there were no lights anywhere in here, the daylight coming in was bouncing off of things so nicely that you were just getting a feeling of, we're 10% of the way there, and what's this gonna feel like when it's done? So in this, you can see the channel is cut into the ceiling. When we did that, we were cutting through the sheetrock, and then there was a weird gap, and then there was the plaster, and then lathing, which was kind of like, all right, well, why is there this gap, and why did they cover the ceiling that way as well? Ignoring that and just planning to move forward, I started mudding everything, taping and mudding. Then I got another bug up my butt and decided, well, I'm gonna rip down all the sheetrock on the ceiling, because why not? So in this photo, I've done so, and please note that the mud on the wall, the joint compound, is not even dry. And I was ripping the ceiling down, which ended up hitting that mud and just destroying work that I just completed. And this is a prime example of me being me, where I don't think about things sometimes and I just do it. In tearing the ceiling out, you can see they had put these kind of metal risers on, and at the time I did not know why those would be there, and they had like little wedges underneath them. I didn't realize at the time that the point of those was to level the ceiling, because the ceiling has a huge dip on going in two different directions now. I didn't realize that was leveling it out. So I just ripped them out because I was like, I don't need these. You can see how bad, I'm sure that was lead-based paint, how bad that was all crackled and coming off. And this was also where the knob and tube was powering that light. I don't know if we can tell in this photo or not. It's hard to tell. There were scorch marks where the knob and tube came in, because it's just not a safe electrical component. I don't know why, if you were redoing your whole kitchen after a fire, why you would leave something in that was so dangerous and not replace it. I don't understand that. It would have been easier, and had I known the ceiling was as unlevel as it was, I would have done this, but it would have been easier to rip that ceiling out, put shims in the ceiling to essentially reframe it, and then go from there. New wiring, yada yada. So I started the process. My parents finished it the next day with getting the rest of that down. I will say the nice thing about taking out plaster and lathe is, for the most part, the plaster comes out really easy. You just whack it and it shatters and falls off. The lathing, it also comes out pretty easy because it's tiny little nails that hold it to the studs. A little bit harder to get out. But we thought, let's just leave the lathing up. We can attach the new ceiling directly to it and go from there. At least we can see what's going on now. Everything's open. My dad ultimately felt that we should put sheetrock on the ceiling instead of just attaching the beadboard to it, because from a fire safety standpoint, the sheetrock provides a better protection in delaying fire from going through stuff. Before that happened though, I was ready to texture the walls. Now, every wall in the house has the same texture. It was a good solution at the time. I don't like it now, but there were reasons that I did it apart from let's add texture. Most of the rooms in the house had wallpaper. I did not want to spend my time removing the glue for it. So my solution was, all right, well, add texture to the walls with plaster. That resolves it. And for the most part, it did. There's a couple areas upstairs where there is a little bit of an issue with it, but it's fine. Now that it's been a couple years, this texture is not staying, and that's not because I'm gonna rip the walls out. It's just going to either be replastered smooth or it's going to be covered. What I would do, I bought a hopper, and what you do is you would fill the hopper with joint compound that you had watered down. So you were kind of making it like a pancake batter texture. I would hook up the air compressor to it, and you'd hold it up and you'd fire that thing at the wall, and it would just, you know, splatter, splatter, splatter all over the wall. I would do a whole section, and then I would go back with a wide blade spatula and not smooth it down, it's called a knockdown texture, but smooth out the bumps so you had like areas that were, I don't know if you can see them, areas that were smoother, some that were still bumpy, whatever. This wall's super beat up, so don't judge me if you can see that. This work was exhausting because the hopper probably weighed 15 pounds maybe, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're non-stop above your head, down to the floor, go to the next one, crouch down, go to the next, crouch down. For a space as big as this, it was just murder on your shoulders. And it wasn't just the kitchen that was happening, because I was spraying that in the laundry room as well at the time. Then you have the walls textured, which means you can then start priming your walls with drywall primer. That meant another step closer to this being a kitchen. Then we put up the ceiling. I think I might have sent this to my friend Andrew, or I might have sent it to my brother. I don't remember, but he had asked how it was going, and I was just pissed. Because I didn't want to do the sheetrock for the ceiling. I was so ready to just be done with this, and did it at my father's insistence, and I'm happy that we did do this. But then you had a ceiling in, and all of a sudden you have electrical again. So that being said, that concludes part 1. Thanks so much for joining. Next week, we are going to be going through part 2, which, as I said, is making it a kitchen. So we've got the walls, we've got some electrical. Let's get cracking on it. So again, thanks so much for joining. If you had any questions on anything you saw in the video today, I am so happy to talk about it and share it. Please let me know in the comments below. You can also ask me on Instagram at restoring_Sean. I'm happy to answer your questions there as well. But until next week, Wednesday, take care, and I will see you soon. Bye.